Taiwan is caught in the middle of the intensifying US-China rivalry over critical minerals. Rare earths are essential for the island nation's net zero carbon goal by 2050 and its semiconductor industry. But China's dominance and export bans threaten Taiwan's supply chains, especially at a time of rising cross-strait tensions. The semiconductor industry, which forms the backbone of Taiwan's economy, is highly dependent on rare earths. So how is Taiwan affected by China's chokehold, and what is it doing to shield its industries from disruption? I am joined in the studio by Dimitar Gueorguiev, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the Political Science Department of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Thank you very much for being part of the program.
Thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
Now, as we mentioned, Taiwan is a critical player in the global semiconductor industry. It relies on rare earths for components and from a lot of the stage of the process of throughout the manufacturing of semiconductors. So how do China's export controls now affect Taiwan, or have they? What is the potential of affecting Taiwan's semiconductor industry?
Yeah, the potential is certainly there, and it's multi-layered. I think it's important to recognize that one layer is the cross-straits layer, kind of the bilateral layer, but the other one is much more systemic and diffuse, because even if the controls that China is likely to throttle affect third parties, let's say Japan or South Korea, they end up impacting Taiwan as well, because Taiwan is kind of the downstream player that needs all of these inputs for those final products. And so in that regard, it's much more diffuse. I think on the cross-straits bilateral layer, it's probably less severe. I think Beijing has a very clear political interest in making sure that Taiwan continues to be tethered and dependent on China, and so it doesn't want to sacrifice some of those connections, but the third-party restrictions could end up impacting Taiwan quite a bit.
So Taiwan's been investing in recycling and alternative technologies. How much has that had an impact, and is that even a possibility to perhaps take over a significant amount of its dependence on China for rare earths?
Significant, no. I think the most current estimates is that recycled rare earths are probably less than 1% in contributing to the overall demand, and so that's a drop in the bucket. Taiwan is probably more than that because it is clearly facing more challenges, but still it's a drop in the bucket. Taiwan is, I think, in the lead on some other approaches, like coming up with alternatives for rare earth magnets, using induction motors or ferrite magnets, but those are inferior to the rare earth magnets. So again, that is going to help a little bit on the margins, but not significantly so. So maintaining good connections with partners, especially partners in the semiconductor industry, to kind of manage those disruptions and be able to shift resources from one party to another during periods of tension, I think is the most important, but also maintaining lines of communication, allowing brokers in Taiwan to be able to facilitate imports from China, which is done in a very regulated and transparent process. I think those are the essential ways. Recycling and alternatives are going to help on the margin, but only marginally.
Okay, you kind of touched on this, but how much can China really pressure Taiwan through rare earths? How much can it use its rare earth advantage to get Taiwan perhaps to, in some ways, to be able to, I guess, put pressure on Taiwan?
It certainly can. The question is, would it want to? And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think so. I think Beijing has a very clear political agenda that prioritizes keeping Taiwan connected and tethered to the mainland, which includes maintaining these supply lines. So if we do see them being leveraged, I think it will be temporarily and only minimally. That said, the mainland can pressure Taiwan by, let's say, putting restrictions on the Japanese, and that will indirectly affect the industry in Taiwan.
And without, okay, worst case scenario, and you've said that it wouldn't want to completely cut off supplies, but if it does, then does that basically bring Taiwan's industries to an abrupt halt?
Would it bring them to an abrupt halt? Depends on how long those restrictions last. I think that we mentioned stockpiling and things like this earlier. Nobody is ignorant of these risks, and so there are buffers in there. And with rare earths, they're not like cabbages and milk. They don't spoil on the shelf, so you can stockpile, but those stockpiles are not going to last very long. So would it be an abrupt overnight shutdown? No. But if it's a sustained squeeze, let's say that lasts over several months, that would really significantly undermine Taiwan's ability to maintain this industry.
China's rare earth dominance has come at a significant environmental cost for China. And that is possibly part of the reason why China's managed to, or many other countries have been reluctant to invest in their own rare earth industries. Now, the environmental costs and the environmental impact, how much does that actually factor in now to countries deciding on developing their rare earths?
I mean, I think it factors in a great deal, right? The externalities of this industry, which is very dirty and very resource intensive, are huge. A factor of 20, where you produce 1 ton of some rare earth, you're producing 20 tons of pollutants. And these are really serious heavy metal pollutants that are hard to get rid of. Now, China has made those investments. They have already made those sacrifices. So it's easier for them to continue pushing that line. New entrants are going to face a lot of pushback, especially those in more open societies where people can voice opposition, and so that's going to slow things down. So trying to replicate what China has done, I think, is a losing strategy.
Are there any alternatives to rare earths?
I think we mentioned that a little bit. There are some alternatives. There are ways of designing motors that are not magnet dependent. There are ferrite magnets that are not dependent on rare earths, but they are just simply inferior in terms of high load and high intensity use to the rare earth magnet. So at the moment, not so much. When we think about this problem, though, it is something that doesn't really suit itself to simple market mechanics, right? If we continue thinking about simply coming up with alternatives or replicating what the Chinese have done, I don't think we're going to make much headway. But if major players like the United States start thinking about rare earths more as an infrastructure issue, then you can get public support financing behind more coordinated projects, more careful projects that take into account the environmental externalities, and they're going to come at a cost. And so that's part of it. The other part that I'm worried about as an American is that a lot of the market mechanisms that would have complemented a public investment strategy, like a shift to renewables, like a shift to electrification that would have increased demand and made these investments more fruitful for private actors, have been undercut by recent policy shifts. So we're kind of trying to do two things that are contradictory at the same time. We're trying to become less dependent on rare earths as a nation, but at the same time we're undermining the market incentives for making that type of investment.
So you talk about, the concerns about the environment and that being perhaps a big reason why many countries did not fully invest in their rare earth industries or manufacturing or refining. But given this, how technology's evolved since, we've started making rare earths a big part of our industries, why do you think there hasn't been more kind of thought put into how to refine or produce these rare earths with less environmental impact?
Well, part of the answer is simply that China provided them at a low cost and in a very easy to acquire way. And so the incentives, kind of the will to make these big investments in both in research and development and the harder part, which is actually setting up the industry, just wasn't there. If you can get it from the Chinese at a low cost and at a high quality, why bother? Why make that effort?
Now, recent trade talks in London and Geneva resulted in a deal to ease rare earth export restrictions. They were temporary, but it excludes military applications and expires in 6 months. Can you tell us what the implications of this temporary reprieve is and perhaps how the U.S. should prepare for future restrictions?
Well, the temporary part is worth underscoring, right? That temporary nature of the deal means that any sort of kind of deep pivot in the United States or partners is going to be undermined by the temporary nature of this deal. So yes, right now we have some easing of tensions, but that creates a market environment that is also temporary. So who can plan for that? Who can incorporate that into a decades-long investment plan? And so everybody's going to be waiting to see what happens after those 6 months. And so if after those 6 months, then we kick the can down the road again for another negotiation, for another temporary reprieve, that again is going to push forward any sort of large-scale development.
So in reality, how much is the U.S. paying credence to China's rare earths exports and controls when it comes to trade negotiations? Is there really that much weight behind? Is the U.S. really thinking that this is a big danger and therefore it is worth kind of easing up some of those or giving in to a certain extent to China?
Well, it's surprising to me at least to see how in the first months of the Trump administration it seemed to catch some of the people in Washington by surprise, because we had known this is a problem for a very, very long time. As you started off in our conversation, this has been an on and off discussion for more than a decade, and yet somehow in trade negotiations suddenly it became, wow, China really has leverage on this issue. So I think they are paying credence to it, but again, it is something that requires either a very costly, deep commitment that is going to extend well beyond the Trump administration to really fix, or short-term solutions which result in temporary negotiations and reprieve. And so what I think we're seeing is an option that is attractive, that is short-term, but doesn't necessarily fix the problem from the perspective of the U.S. government.
And if I'm going to flip that question on its head, how much can China really leverage rare earths then in trade talks, not just on anything to do with rare earths, but in general, in the bigger picture, and give it some real muscle in the trade talks?
Well, I think China has to be careful with this again. Like I said earlier, it wants to throttle, it wants to demonstrate that it has this leverage, but it doesn't want to put the throttle up to max pain. If it does, then that could genuinely inspire a move away from China. By keeping it at middle levels, it opens up the opportunity for negotiation. It opens up the opportunity that pain will be eased in the short term, and that I think delays any sort of real deep commitment. And I think that there's I guess an analogy here to U.S. export controls on high tech and semiconductors. When the United States put really significant controls on the export of leading edge chips to China, that again provided a lot more incentive and impetus for Chinese producers to try and become self-sufficient. And so China doesn't want to make that kind of mistake on rare earths. It likes using this stick, but it's not going to break it.
Okay, so looking ahead, as more and more industries rely on rare earths, and therefore China, what can countries like the U.S., like Taiwan, do to alter their supply chains so that there is some kind of a give in it, where they're not completely relying on China?
As I mentioned earlier, I think treating rare earths not as simply a commodity that's driven by market principles, but treating it as something like public infrastructure, like roads and bridges and hospitals that require long-term investments without clear profit outlooks for public and private investors. That's essential. And if that can be done, and if it can be done amongst partners in a coordinated way, you can pool resources. So let's say the United States and Canada, right? This was a big topic of discussion prior to the Trump administration on how the United States and Canada could collaborate in terms of their comparative advantages, both in terms of points of extraction, transportation, and refining. With the relationship between Ottawa and Washington, D.C. in disarray over tariffs, those discussions have simply been stalled and pushed down the road. And so I think that's really essential, is trying to figure out how we can treat rare earths not simply as a commodity, but as a really important infrastructure for modern development and modern technologies. What I worry about is that what we'll continue seeing is these short-term solutions that result in temporary reprieves, maybe some very targeted investments, such as for the military use rare earths in the United States. And one area which I'm particularly worried about is the deep sea mining, because that is that is out of sight from the public eye. We really don't know what's going on down at the sea level, but from what I understand, it's very environmentally damaging, perhaps magnitudes more than on Turanian development.
Who's doing that at the moment?
Well, China is one of the biggest players, if not the biggest player. The Canadians have some kind of latent scale and capacity in the United States under the Trump administration is poised to make a big move into deep sea mining.
So for Taiwan, would you say the solution is where it may not have its own resources in the country itself, would be to invest in other countries to develop their industries?
Yes, and also to partner and create terms of agreement with other countries that also benefit from Taiwan's semiconductor capacity in Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain nexus. So countries like Vietnam that also have, as you pointed out earlier, deposits and refining capacity. Countries like Malaysia, the South Koreans and the Japanese, to try and create shock absorbers in their respective economies that can help offset these temporary, what I think are temporary price fluctuations. Right? But trying to simply become self-dependent, self-sufficient on rare earths is not, I think, a viable strategy for a mid-sized kind of economy like Taiwan.
Thank you so much, Dimitar Gueorguiev. It's been great to have you on the program.